Hey, Ron here from Military Images Magazine with a new episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail. You know, I get contributions of images, Civil War portraits, all the time in my role as editor of the magazine. I don't always mention them on this show, but they come in quite regularly, including this one that came in today from one of our top contributors. His name is Tom Glass. And Tom has a particular interest in Civil War era portraits of generals and politicians in the Union and the Confederacy. And whenever he adds a new image to his collection, he does a high resolution scan and he emails it to me. I get them fairly often from Tom, and I try to publish as many as I can. Well, today's image, the gentleman pictured here, he's not in uniform. He's dressed in civilian clothes. I absolutely do not recognize him, but he is identified, and his name is Maunsell Bradhurst Field, 1822 to 1875 are his life dates. It's not a name that I know. And I must confess, I'm not a student of the Lincoln assassination. I've read my share of books, but I didn't know that Field was very, very much associated with Lincoln's deathbed. At the time that Lincoln was assassinated, Field was an assistant secretary of the Treasury in Washington. So I'm going to let you listen in Field's own words in a letter that he wrote and was published in the New York Times on April 17th, 1865, just a couple of days after Lincoln's death. And so the memories of those events are fresh in the mind of Field. So I'm not going to get in the way of Field's narrative. I'm just going to read you the letter. I think it's quite fascinating. So it's headlined, Last Moments of the President. Interesting letter from Maunsell B. Field, Esquire. Here we go. Here's his words. On Friday evening, April 14th, 1865, I was reading the evening paper in the reading room of Willard's Hotel at about 10:30 when I was startled by the report that an attempt had been made a few minutes before to assassinate the president at Ford's Theater. At first, I could scarcely credit it, but in a few minutes, the statement was confirmed by a number of people who came in separately, all telling the same story. About 15 minutes previously, I had parted with Mr. Mellor of the Treasury Department, and he had retired to his room. Immediately upon receiving this intelligence, I notified him of it, and we together proceeded to the scene of the alleged assassination. We found not only considerable crowds on the streets leading to the theater, but a very large one in front of the theater and of the house directly opposite. I'm speaking here, that's the Petersen House, where the president had been carried after the attempt upon his life. With some difficulty, I obtained ingress to the house. I was at once informed by Miss Harris, daughter of Senator Harris, that the president was dying, which statement was confirmed by 3 or 4 other persons whom I met in the hall. But I was desired not to communicate his condition to Mrs. Lincoln, who was in the front parlor. I went into the parlor, where I found Mrs. Lincoln, no other lady being present except Miss Harris, as already mentioned. She at once recognized me and begged me to run for Dr. Stone or some other medical man. She was not weeping, but appeared hysterical and exclaimed in rapid succession over and over again, "Oh, why didn't he kill me? Why didn't he kill me?" I was starting from the house to go for Dr. Stone when I met at the door Major Eckert, that's Thomas Eckert, of the War Department, who informed me he was going directly to Stone's house, Stone having already been sent for, but not having yet arrived. I then determined to go for Dr. Hall, whose precise residence I did not know. Upon inquiring of the crowd, I was told it was over Frank Taylor's bookstore on the avenue. This proved to be a mistake, and I was compelled to return to his actual residence on the avenue above 9th Street. I found the doctor at home and dressed, and he at once consented to accompany me. Arriving in the neighborhood of the house, I had great difficulty in passing the guard and only succeeded at last in having the doctor introduced, admission being refused to myself. I returned to Willard's, it now being about 2 o'clock in the morning, and remained there until between 3 and 4 o'clock, when I again went to the house where the president was lying, in company with Mr. Andrews, late surveyor of the port of New York. I obtained ingress this time without any difficulty and was enabled to take Mr. Andrews in with me. I proceeded at once to the room in which the president was lying, which was a bedroom and an extension on the first or parlor floor of the house. The room is small and is ornamented with prints, a very familiar one of Lansdeer's, a white horse, being prominent directly over the bed. The bed was a double one, and I found the president lying diagonally across it with his head at the outside. The pillows were saturated with blood, and there was considerable blood upon the floor immediately under him. There was a patchwork coverlet thrown over the president, which was only so far removed from time to time as to enable the physicians in attendance to feel the arteries of the neck or the heart, and he appeared to have been divested of all clothing. His eyes were closed and injected with blood, both the lids and the portions surrounding the eyes being as black as if they had been bruised by violence. He was breathing regularly, but with effort, and did not seem to be struggling or suffering. The persons present in the room were the Secretary of War, the Secretary of the Navy, the Postmaster General, the Attorney General, the Secretary of the Treasury, who, however, remained only till about 5 o'clock, the Secretary of the Interior, the Assistant Secretary of the Interior, myself, General Augur, General Halleck, General Meigs, and, during the last moments, Captain Robert Lincoln and Major John Hay. On the foot of the bed sat Dr. Stone. Above him, and directly opposite the president's face, an army surgeon, to me a stranger, another army surgeon was standing, frequently holding the pulse, and another gentleman not in uniform, but whom I understood to be also an army surgeon, stood a good deal of the time leaning over the headboard of the bed. For several hours, the breathing above described continued regularly and apparently without pain or consciousness. But about 7 o'clock, a change occurred, and the breathing, which had been continuous, was interrupted at intervals. These intervals became more frequent and of longer duration, and the breathing more feeble. Several times the interval was so long that we thought him dead, and the surgeon applied his finger to the pulse, evidently to ascertain if such was the fact. But it was not till 22 minutes past 7 o'clock in the morning that the flame flickered out. There was no apparent suffering, no convulsive action, no rattling of the throat, none of the ordinary premonitory symptoms of death. Death, in this case, was a mere cessation of breathing. The fact had not been ascertained 1 minute when Dr. Gurley offered up a prayer. The few persons in the room were all profoundly affected. The president's eyes after death were not, particularly the right one, entirely closed. I closed them myself with my fingers, and one of the surgeons brought pennies and placed them on the eyes, and subsequently substituted for them silver $half. In a very short time, the jaw commenced slightly falling, although the body was still warm. I called attention to this and had it immediately tied up with a pocket handkerchief. The expression immediately after death was purely negative, but in 15 minutes, there came over the mouth, the nostrils, and the chin, a smile that seemed almost an effort of life. I had never seen upon the president's face an expression more genial and pleasing. The body grew very cold gradually, and I left the room before it had entirely stiffened. Curtains had been previously drawn down by the Secretary of War. So there you have it. An amazing, powerful, emotional, disturbing, and yet somehow a beautiful account of President Lincoln's last hours lying diagonally with a coverlet over him, surrounded by members of his political family and his own personal family, just after the assassination in Washington, D.C. So there you have it. Today's episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail, where we have the firsthand account of an Assistant Secretary Field. Take care. We'll see you in the next episode.